Amy Schiller. I'm an associate fellow here at the Hannah Arendt Center. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning, an honor to be moderating this panel with some really distinguished participants here. They'll each speak for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to have a conversation amongst us. Batya Ungar Sargon is the opinion editor of the Jewish Daily Forward. Her work has appeared in the New York Review of Books, in Foreign Policy, and many other publications. Next to her is Reverend Jacqui Lewis, senior minister at Middle Collegiate Church, a multiracial and inclusive congregation in New York City. Among her many publications and contributions to discourse, she's frequently on MSNBC. My apologies, your program, it says Annie Seaton. We are actually joined by Shahana McKinney-Baldon, who is an activist and educator from Wisconsin, former classroom teacher. She's had leadership roles in Jewish education organizations, and is a participant and a Torah carrier with the Jewish Women of Color marching delegation at the National Women's March in 2019. So this should be a really rich conversation with many different perspectives on the very broad topic of Black-Jewish relations. I think we've talked a lot about these about anti-Semitism and racism as ideologies and concepts, and maybe now this morning we'll get to talk a little bit more about the lived realities and the lived experiences and alliances and disjunctures that those ideologies have wrought in our own lives. So with that, I'm going to invite Batya to speak first, followed by Jacqui, followed by Shahanna. Thanks.
Hello? Okay. I had some remarks prepared about Zionism and racism and Black-Jewish relations. But after what happened at my panel last night, I realized there was something else I was brought here to say. And I apologize to anyone in the room here who was not here last night, especially to the young people. Our panel was protested. And before the panel, I met with some of the protesters. And I asked them, why were they protesting this panel? It was the only panel with 3 Jews on it, and the only panel where we were a Jewish community speaking about anti-Semitism. In fact, I invited them to come protest this panel because I was gonna talk about Zionism on this panel, and I said, you know, it would be more appropriate to protest. It was an anti-Israel protest, a pro-Palestinian protest, and I said, come protest when we're talking about Zionism. That would make a lot more sense. Their response was that the discourse of anti-Semitism is inherently bound up in the Israel question. You know who thinks that? David Duke thinks that. David Duke thinks that talking about anti-Semitism hurts Palestinians. David Duke thinks that the actions of one Jew are the responsibility of another Jew. Thus, I, the #1 publisher of Palestinian Voices in America, The Forward, a Jewish newspaper where I am the opinion editor, publishes more op-eds by Palestinians than the New York Times, The Nation, and The Washington Post combined. I, who have spent my entire career embedded in the Palestinian community, who have convinced more Israelis to vote for the joint Arab list than you will meet in your life, I am worthy of protesting when I try to talk not about Israel, but about anti-Semitism. And I'm not Israeli. It's because I am a Jew. You know, I don't blame the protesters because they're young and they're kids and it's their job to be wrong about things. I'm not bothered by their silly protest. I'm bothered by the cowardice of my fellow conference goers, the academics and writers and intellectuals who were brought here to learn how to fight racism and anti-Semitism, and not one of you could find the guts to stand up and use your free speech to call out a blatantly racist act. And I know you're sitting there thinking, oh, but they were protesting Israel, they were protesting Zionists. 97% of Jews worldwide are Zionists. 97%. Why is that? Why do you think that is? There are the same number of anti-Zionist Jews as there are Black women who voted for Trump, okay? So while I'm sure when I leave this stage, some of the Jews here will reassure you that the protest was fine, ask yourself, would you allow Diamond and Silk to tell you what's racist? You certainly should not. I'm horrified by your cowardice, by your self-justifications, you, who I called luminaries, whose books I have read. There's nothing more that I feel I can say or hear here. I just feel that the conversation for me has broken down. I cannot convince you. And I feel, having witnessed this, that I cannot be convinced. I feel shut down. And I hate feeling that way. So I'm going to leave you with this, and then I'm actually going to leave. The next time someone says, "What have you done to help Jews as anti-Semitism has spiked across the nation, as Jews have been murdered at their place of worship, and Orthodox Jews get beaten to a pulp day after day in Brooklyn," you can say, "I sat idly by as Jews were protested for trying to talk about anti-Semitism. I allowed a Jewish woman to be held accountable for the actions of a country halfway around the world where she can't even vote because of her ethnicity. I egged that protest on. I applauded it. And then I went to a party."
So I want to thank Batya for coming and for saying that and for being at the panel last night. I agree with a lot of what you said. And I think that many people in the room probably feel that they agree with what you said. We're at a conference, we're at an academic institution, and the conference is about hard questions, racism and anti-Semitism. And we let people speak and we let people disagree. It just happened on the last panel. They're often hard questions. And I think that when protesters protest, they can look good or they can look silly, depending on your views. I thought last night, Ruth Weiss treated them with the respect or the disrespect that they deserved, which was to ignore them for the most part. I understand that you thought people should have, I guess, responded to the protesters. My view is that they're making a protest. We go on with the show. We go on with the conversation. We go on with what we're trying to do, which is have an intellectual conversation and engage it and learn from each other. I think what you just did was very brave and very good, and I'm glad you did it. I'd ask you and encourage you to stay and continue in the conversation. I'd understand if you left. But I just do want to say we very much respect your being here and your participation. And I hope that you will stay, but we will continue. And thank you very much.
Batya. Batya. I was so looking forward to talking with you. I understand if you need to go, but I'm Jacqui Lewis, and I just wanted you to know that I'm looking forward to the conversation, whether it happens now or later. I think it's so important. So, okay.
So I think in the spirit of Roger's remarks, this conversation absolutely encompasses Batya's points and Batya's perspective and extends beyond it. And so I would like to just, as Roger suggested, go on with the show. And when we get to our Q&A after we hear from our other two panelists, we'll incorporate the incident from last night and also the points that Batya has brought up about our response to it. So with that, I'd like to go to Shahana McKinney-Baldon.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Shahana McKinney-Baldon. I bring you greetings from a faraway land called Wisconsin. I'm an Ashkenazi African-American woman, and I'm very glad to be here with all of you, my people. Special shout out to the Bard High School Early College Program students. So glad to have you here today. Show some love to the young people. This is your institution. I'm very glad to be a guest here. Thank you for welcoming me. I do work around racial and ethnic diversity among Jews, lately with a focus on the Midwest region. I'm so excited for these young leaders who are pushing against these binaries. intersectionality is a thing now. I don't have to explain as much when I show up talking about Black Jews and other Jews who are targeted by racism. And I very much appreciate the young leaders for being here and the youth leadership that I've experienced here at Bard. I would like to say that I am a Zionist. I was raised in Habonim Dror. I do not believe that pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel are a binary. And one of the things that I think is cowardly is the lack of a progressive, and certainly the lack of a leftist, analysis of anti-Semitism at this conference. Now, I missed a few parts. I went to get snacks, I came in a little late, so it's conceivable that I've missed something, but generally, and judging by the applause that I got from folks over here, I think that I might be onto something. So speaking of binaries, I'm glad to be here along with the good brother, Dr. Lewis Gordon, disrupting the stereotype that Black and Jewish is an either-or type of thing. It's never been that way. There have always been people who are both Black and Jewish since the beginning. I'm shocked that this is a conference on racism and anti-Semitism, and that there are so few Jewish people of color presenting here. It's 2019, it's 5780.
Nice.
And by Jewish people of color, Shana Tova, my sister. And by Jewish people of color, here's what I mean. I mean Jews who are also targeted by racism. So Black, Latinx, Asian, Indigenous, Sephardim, and Mizrahim, all who are marginalized by racism and are pulled toward Ashkenormative narratives and practices as Jews. I don't mean it as a joke, and it's not a term that I've just made up here. So you should Google it. Are pulled toward Ashkenormative narratives and practices as Jews in the modern world cannot be disentangled from our lived experience with race. Harkening back to Dr. Kendi's comments about race is not real scientifically, but we experience it as if it was real. And I certainly do experience racism, and there are Jewish people in our Jewish communities who experience racism. I work at the University of Wisconsin, and I run a project there called Edot HaMidwest. Mishu tafas et ze? Edot HaMidwest. Edot for short. It's about racial and ethnic diversity among Jews in Midwest communities. There has been a lot of movement around including and lifting up the leadership of Jewish people of color on the coasts, but our Midwest communities have been underserved in that work. We hope you'll visit us online at edot.wisc.edu. That's edot.wisc.edu. Click on the donate tab. We're running all on donations. The university is not paying anything for this project, and we need your support to be better equipped to do our work. So I'm very glad to be invited to share my perspectives on this panel. You should not be having conversations on Black-Jewish relations or racism and anti-Semitism without Jews of color being centered. I'm happy to bring other elements of diversity to this discussion as well, my Midwest heritage certainly, and also the fact that I'm not faculty. I'm what we call at my university academic staff. We are often the ones doing the work that enables the faculty to do their work. And I want to give a special shout out to all the non-faculty folks who work in higher education. This is actually a very salient identity where I work at the University of Wisconsin. The non-faculty really do have a minoritized experience. I thought I would use my time today to tell you a little bit about my family, a quick overview of my story. I would start off with a quick explanation to answer all the questions that many of you are thinking about right now. Is she really Jewish? and etc. I would start off with a little storytelling, my parents, how I grew up. In the words of Hannah Arendt, storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it. But of course, this is not true. The way we tell our stories is never neutral. There's always subtext, there's always nuance, always choices on what's included and what's omitted. And for those of us who don't fit neatly into others' understandings of us and them, telling our stories is so often demanded of us. It's about explaining ourselves, proving that we belong where we are, which is often home. So I'm struggling around how or whether to tell you my story, to validate that I'm really Jewish, when no white-looking person in this room would be obliged to do so in any Jewish space, here or in Israel. So I'm not going to do that, and it's an act of defiance. I think generally when people say Zionism and racism, black-Jewish relations, they're talking about how sad they are that the black-Jewish coalition fell apart. And black people are mad at Jews because the Black Panthers or somebody said that white Jews were oppressing brown Palestinians, but that black people just don't understand, that they're just confused. After all, Israel went and airlifted all those Ethiopians to Israel. I think that the lack of nuance is in part about the limits of language and the terminologies that we're using and the euphemisms that we've set up to talk about who we are and who they are and hurting and even killing people because of us and them. But we can't have this conversation without addressing the whole story of racism and Jews, which is partly that Zionism is the liberation movement of European Jews as a response to generations of violent hate and xenophobia against Jews, and that Jew hatred actually predates, as well as informs, what we call race and racism. The whole story is partly that when Jews moved around to different places at different points in history, their group membership changed. There was no race. They were this race. They weren't that race. And the meaning of race shifted as well and continues to do so. Part of the whole story is that today there are Jews who are thought of as, or they think of themselves as, white, and that there are Jews who are thought of and think of ourselves as and are treated as people of color. It's partly about the racialization of Jews by the Nazis and how the idea of race bled into the experience in and around the modern state of Israel and other places in many different ways over time. So I want to have a deep and nuanced conversation about the whole story of Jews and race, and I haven't heard that nuance here yet. If you recognize my face, it might be because you saw my photo on January 19th of this year when I was part of a delegation of Jewish women of color leading the Women's March in Washington, D.C. I was the one carrying the Torah. You might recall that there was a kerfuffle about the Women's March this year. Tamika Mallory, Linda Sarsour, someone said Farrakhan, everybody freaked out. The Jewish organizations told Jewish women not to participate. The narrative became about racist white Jews trying to manipulate, and that the black community was so very anti-Semitic. And we said, oh no, and we activated our network of Jewish women of color. We had a delegation of about 100 Jewish women of color and allies, and we led the Women's March. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, Google Women's March Torah, and you'll see us there. Part of that action was publishing an open letter that you can find online at medium.com/JWOC, Jewish Women of Color. So JWOC marching, one word. Medium.com/JWOC marching. We published an open letter, and I'd like to read an excerpt of that letter for you now, if I can find it. As Jewish women of color, we are committed to and united with our Jewish family and allies in fighting the growing threat of white supremacist and white nationalist violence in our country. And we are clear that this threat is not coming chiefly from our allies in the social justice movements that we navigate. We reject any assertion that there's more anti-Semitism in African American communities than in others, and any belief that African American leaders, and women specifically, I'm talking Ilhan Omar here, should be singled out for particular attention toward addressing the impacts of the growing presence of anti-Semitism in our world. There is anti-Semitism in the air. There is anti-Semitism on the left and on the right. My message is, right, you handle your anti-Semites, and we'll handle our anti-Semitism. But the chief threat is not anti-Semitism on the left. It's anti-Semitism on the right. That's the anti-Semitism that's turning violent. And take a look at what the Washington Post reported yesterday about a fundraising letter that went out from the GOP in Virginia. You don't hear anything about that because it didn't come from Ilhan Omar, but actually I have a quote here, and I'll just close my remarks with this. This fundraising letter said, and it should send shivers down your spine, this letter invoked National Democratic donors, and it says, this should be a grave warning to patriots like yourself. The Soros-Bloomberg Democrats win the General Assembly this November, and you won't recognize Virginia anymore. I'm very glad to be here with you today, and I'm excited for a deep and nuanced conversation about racism and Zionism. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Reverend Lewis.
Yeah, thank you, Shahanna. I got to hug one of my heroes today. It was so wonderful to be with you in DC, so wonderful to be with you in that march, so wonderful to watch the women of color lead, the Jewish women of color lead, and to do healing, prophetic work that defies categorization and simple answers. Thank you. So I'm not Jewish, but I am African American, and I'm a clergy and a psychologist, and I follow in ministry, like my dude, my hero, the guy that is like my mentor, the one I preach about, was in fact a Jewish person of color. Right. And I have the distinct impression if Christians everywhere were more clear about that, it would heal a bunch of craziness. How many of you in the room would claim to be Christian? Okay. So I want to just tell the story of Jesus for just a second, to kind of locate myself in this conversation and to talk about the problem of anti-Semitism in the church for just a second, which I just find to be outrageous and insane. So this is a story, right? I mean, I wasn't there. There seems to be an historic person named Yeshua who was born around 3 AD or 0 AD. It seems to be true that there was a family that had a boy child. Yeshua would have been his name, or Yeshua, ben Joseph, son of Joseph. Seems to be historically true that he grew up as the son of a handyman, and that his father Joe was a carpenter, but really more like fixing small things, not building houses. The way our story goes, the way our faith story goes, the one that gets you shopping at Christmas time, is that Mary, his mother, and Joe, his father, did not have sex. Okay. And that she was pregnant anyway. I can pick on it because it's my story. And she was pregnant anyway, and that there was a scandal because she was pregnant. Now, she said the Holy Spirit did it, but they said maybe she was raped by a Roman soldier. Either way, this child was conceived in the middle of a scandal, and it was within the rights of Joseph to divorce her or stone her to death. But he didn't. And so they have this child. He's born in a manger. You know how this goes. There's no room in the end. He's born in a cow trough. They move from Bethlehem back to their hometown in Nazareth, which is in Galilee, which is in Palestine, ancient Palestine. Not today's Palestine, but ancient Palestine. Let a clergy say that Jesus is a Jew from Palestine, and the hate mail cometh. But that's our story. Our story is that he is a child of David's lineage, that the people who gave birth to him are people who are Semites and people who are African. That he's born around the cradle of civilization, that his ancestors, that his genealogy is already mixed race. That he is a mixed race, so I'm going to put it all together, a mixed race, poor, African Semitic, homeless baby who only survives his life because his parents take him to Egypt, where he is welcomed and passes for Egypt, which means he's likely not white with blue eyes, and he lives because he's a refugee and welcomed, and then does his ministry. And this is the foundation of our faith. But he's Jewish, right? So that somehow the early church decided that the Jews did something bad, and they were supposed to be punished for all eternity, for both, quote, doing God's will, which is ridiculous that God would have a baby and kill it, but that's another talk for another time, that they would then, somehow the church would embed its identity in being against the one who was Jewish. Do you see how ridiculous that is? But this is the formative story, and it's not just the formative story of Christianity, it's like a formative story for the United States of America. It's a formative story of like, you Jewish people were chosen, and now we're chosen. We get on boats, we travel across the land. There's a thing called doctrine of discovery, therefore we get to have it. And this Christian thing is then at the root of something like white totalitarianism that means you can take the land from the indigenous people, build the stuff on the sweat and labor of black bodies who are inferior to you implicitly, and God designed inferior to you. And you can grow a whole society based on narratives of exclusion. I'm not with that. I'm just not. I'm just not with that. I'm deeply drawn to a mixed race baby that, whether divine or not, taught some beautiful stuff. Like, love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. The first will be last, the last will be first. I mean, just a good rabbi, just good teachings. I'm deeply drawn to the fact that if this story has truth, that God would choose to come all the way down in the form of a marginalized poor one, un pobrecito, who would come all the way down in the form of mixed race flesh so we could all find ourselves in that flesh. I've been to Israel 3 times, once right out of seminary when a wealthy man sent a bunch of us to Israel so we'd know what was happening in the Holy Land. Thank you for that. 2 times at the invitation of the Hartman Institute to be a Christian scholar studying Judaism, doing Havruta with rabbis. Hearing stories of Hebrew life in Hebrew. I had to do that as a Presbyterian, study Hebrew. But to hear culture and language and story from people about their land, in their language, changed my life. I'm deeply drawn to the similarities between the Jews' stories and my stories as an African-American person. That the Exodus narrative really resonates with me. And I'm really interested that white slaveholders stole the Exodus narrative out of the Bible so that black people wouldn't understand the power of Exodus and liberation. I grew up in a black family who taught us that the Jews and the blacks were marginalized throughout time and history, and it would never make sense for us not to be collaborative. So I'm conscious of Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King's friendship. I'm conscious of Susanna's ongoing work in multiracial spaces. And some of my best friends are rabbis. I'm really lucky, blessed to be in a relationship with rabbis across the country. Sharon Brous, who's a Zionist, who is one of my dear friends. Stephanie Colin, right there in New York, who was at Central Synagogue and now has a synagogue in Brooklyn. Some of my best friends are Muslim itinerant rabbis. Hussein Rashid, who is one of the smartest people I know, Linda Sarsour, who is not the devil, actually, but is a beautiful Palestinian Muslim woman organizing for justice. I have a Women's March story to tell about how the craziness with Tamika Mallory and her refusing to decry Farrakhan, who is decried all by himself every day, but her refusing to decry him broke up a movement, and how Linda and Tamika and Carmen stand together, and how Linda Sarsour and Sharon Brous stand together, and how there are rabbis in New York that still meet every 6 weeks and invite this Christian pastor to join them to think about how we're going to disrupt anti-Semitism and racism at the same time. How some of the staunch supporters of Linda Sarsour are rabbis in New York, and how these stories are complicated and these situations are complicated, and how there's no simple answer, except that maybe we have to foreground our individual experience of each other and put in the background the broad prejudices that divide us. I mean, as a little kid in Chicago, we went shopping for shoes in Jewtown. What? I'm 7 years old and the deals are in Jewtown. I don't even know what that means at 7 years old. I just know the deals are there. But those words were used, batted around casually, even in my good family. So it is intentional to be a student of Judaism, because I work for a rabbi named Yeshua. And it's intentional to sort of open my heart to be criticized when I make an anti-Semitic mistake. And I have. And I do. It's important to be a student of human relations and to decide that if we're going to grow ourselves up and change this nation, we have to let down our defenses, and we have to be a little more vulnerable and a little more candid. I'm shaken up here on the stage by this thing that happened. I mean, both the things. The Kendi conversation was exhausting. It was. And this hurt was frightening. And we can leave this space entrenched and reinvigorated by the assumptions we brought to the space. But what I'd rather us do is to examine ourselves fully for how will we contribute to the healing of our nation? And what are we willing to risk to get well? And I will leave it there.
What I'm struck by in both of your remarks is the temporal span that's on this stage, the span of time. So I say that because in theological time, in Kairos, right, like the Exodus is always happening and Jesus is with us, you know, daily. And both of you mentioned, you know, in the span of all the way back to AD to the present day, there are some historical sort of moments that we might latch on to, I think, as we dig a little bit deeper, just to lend some context and texture. Where I'd like to begin is with an anecdote that I first encountered in probably the best Dvar Torah I've ever read, by Rabbi Michael Rothbaum. In this Dvar Torah, this word of Torah, like a sermon in a synagogue, is called, well, actually, I'm not going to tell you what it's called because I would sort of give away the punchline. So it's an anecdote, but it's an illustrative sort of joke. A Jewish man comes to Ellis Island, and we'll call this the early 20th century, and comes to Ellis Island and is using a fake name to escape the Tsar's army, and he repeats the name over and over in his head, and then it's time to give his name to the official at Ellis Island, and he goes, "Oi, Shoim Ferguson," which is Yiddish. Vergessen is Yiddish for forgotten. Oh, I've already forgotten. And the Ellis Island official stamps his papers and says, "Welcome to America, Sean Ferguson." So the title of this sermon is Ferguson, Fargessen. Drawing this parallel, not only between sort of the Ferguson linguistic parallel, but also where Jews were criminalized, heavily criminalized in their earlier years of mass immigration to the United States. And here I am talking about white-passing Ashkenazi Jews for the large part. But he starts with a newspaper article from 1902 criticizing a riot on the Lower East Side, which was in response to what they called, and I want us to just imagine this phrase being deployed today, a police pogrom. A police pogrom. And the language used to describe and criminalize the Jewish population is chillingly similar to that used to describe the residents of Ferguson standing up against what might be considered their own pogrom. Now, I bring all of this to bear because I'm interested in moments where you each feel there's been a kind of forgetting or a disjuncture between the unity that both of you have articulated here, right? There's a coherence and a unity. I'm sure it's not always, smooth and seamless. There's a coherence between your identities as Jewish or allies of Jewish people and as people of color. And so I'm just interested in, first we'll talk maybe on a personal level, and then maybe talk about the historical disjunctures and forgettings that you see having happened.
The first thing that I'm noticing is that there's a whole project called Ferguson Fargessen, and a Jewish person of color was at the center of that project, a Jewish person of color from St. Louis named Koach Baruch Frazier, rabbinical student at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And it would have been good to mention KB.
Thank you for
Centering
telling me
us.
that. I appreciate that.
You're
I apologize. No, I do.
Just making a point. I'd love
No,
to
I
introduce you.
really appreciate you bringing up that gap. That
Yeah.
was important.
Yep. Another forgetting is the mythic nature of the Black Jewish Coalition. There is some myth that's not really about what was actually happening. The Black Jewish Coalition was about the elites of organizations doing coalition building. It wasn't about Black Jewish satyrs in the neighborhood. And I've done a lot of those. I've done those in my family because our satyrs are always Black Jewish satyrs. But you know what I'm talking about, African American Jewish relations events in the communities. So I think that's an important forgetting. What was that coalition? What wasn't it? What have the other coalitions been? What have the coalitions been where people really were in deep personal relationship with each other? Thinking about the communist movement. And so I think that there's a way that actually the ways that is mythicized really takes away from the current day opportunities to do the work.
Oh, that's so important, Shahanna. Thank you for that. I want to say a couple different kinds of things. One being real coalitions, just to be where Shahanna ends. I have a really good friend named Amichai Lau-Levy, who's in New York. I have such a crush on him. He's just as queer as he wants to be, but I just love him, and his kids. But so when I'm with Amichai and I'm with David Ingber and I'm with Ellen Lichtman and I'm with Sharon or Steph, I mean this so sincerely. I feel like I'm with siblings who are resonating around Black Lives Matter, resonating around anti-poverty and voting rights. We laid down in the ground together in the Senate building, you know, afraid of the cops' boots, breathing, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. I'm talking about just like when we were teenagers and we learned if we built a house together for Habitat for Humanity, that would build a relationship. So those coalitions are being built around real justice issues. They're not patina, right? They're not shiny, they're not sparkly. They're not, let's see if we can make it better. Like talking about it, they're like, let's go march and stand in the streets and let's be afraid and let's get arrested. You know, I got arrested with Sharon, you know. We're in a paddy wagon. It hurts to get arrested in a paddy wagon. Singing with some Unitarians and, you know, that feels real to me. And I think that's what Shahanna's point is, like, to what's real and what's shiny. You know, what's real and what's shiny. So that's real. I've learned a lot in real spaces from Jewish colleagues. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? So the Rabbi Jesus tells a story about a Samaritan on the road. The Jericho road is dangerous, the man has been hurt, the man has been wounded, the priest walks by and won't touch him because he's unclean, the Levite walks by and won't touch him because he's unclean, but the Samaritan who's unclean walks by and touches him and heals him. Short story. So Rabbi Jesus is putting together love your neighbor as yourself stuff from the Torah, and the rabbis in Israel say, what does it mean to love your neighbor? It doesn't mean picking your neighbor up off the road because they've been hurt. It actually means caring for your neighbor's cow. Which is to say, if your neighbor's cow wanders in your yard, you don't cook it, eat it, or keep it. You take care of the neighbor's cow. And I think when I'm talking about cows to talk about an ethic of care. Do we have our neighbors' backs? Do we across faith have our neighbors' backs? Do we care about our neighbors' cows, our neighbors' kids, our neighbors' health care, our neighbors' voting rights? We don't. Not for me well enough. I'm not sure when my Jewish friends became white. I used to think they were Jewish, but now they're whiter. My whiter Jewish friends are whiter than they used to be. Do you understand what I'm saying? This one's not white. But my whiter Jewish friends are whiter than they used to be. And if I have my psych hat on, I would say, everybody tries to distance themselves from being black. Psychologically, the world distances itself from blackness. I can't pass for white. So I have a friend who told me, when you are anti-Semite, you're an anti-Semite just because you're in America and America is anti-Semitic. I reject that. But I think I'd say there's a lot of anti-black racism in America. And I'm always looking for more honesty about that and more collaboration around that. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And I don't want it to be like, I don't want us to have oppression Olympics, is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
I don't want us to see who can outdo the other talking about how horrific our stories have been. Because our stories are shit, period. Is that okay that I said that? Yeah. Yours and mine, right? So let's stop competing for who's worse off and try to find more ways to collaborate.
You've both brought up whiteness, the association of Jewishness with whiteness, and we've also heard quite a bit in both days here about how do we define whiteness as an identity versus a system and a structure. I actually think one of the valuable things that I heard, maybe not in the intended manner from the final speaker yesterday, was her definition of anti-Semitism as the exclusion, the construction of politics to exclude Jews. Now, I thought, would that not apply to all forms of racism and anti-Semitism and exclusion? Is the construction of a political system for the exclusion of others of an othered population to participate. So I say that because when we're talking about whiteness and how Jews have become whiter, like what are the markers of whiteness that we're really talking about?
Yeah, that's
Please.
great. White identity development is Lithuanians, Germans, Italians, Greeks, Dutch, everybody who wasn't just Anglo-Saxon Protestant came to America and ultimately lost their ethnicity to be white. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? And so white, talking to a beautiful new friend this morning, white isn't actually an ethnicity at all. But it is an identity about power and privilege, and it's about access and, letting go of the ethnicity and culture and richness of that, your Irishness, your Polishness, those struggles and those stories, and the Jewishness, letting go of that on the way to passing for or participating in white, powerful, class, capitalist structures. That's what I think white is. And I put quotes around it on purpose.
Right.
So maybe there's some black white people. Maybe. I bet John McWhorter and I would have a good talk about that.
Right. But to you, it's a social position.
It is
to
a
you.
social position. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that leads me to a question, because this to me gets at questions I have around Zionism. In part because the state of Israel today has its own internal struggles with racial supremacy amongst its varied populations, intersecting with religious affiliation and the increasing orthodoxy of the orthodoxy. And I ask this because the question is often posed like, is Zionism racism, or does Zionism equal racism? And I think both of you would say no, but the question is if racism and whiteness are different ways of diagnosing a construction of supremacy, how are you each reconciling the enactment of that supremacy with your respective Zionisms?
Well, I think it's dangerous to simply overlay one societally specific conceptualization of identities and politics among those identities onto another. I think that's dangerous. But I do think that there can be meaning made there as well. We also cannot pretend like American racism hasn't been exported all over the world, and that our racism does inform the marginalization of groups in other places, including in Israel. Yes. Anti-Black racism exists in Israel. And if you Google the Israeli Black Panther Party, what you'll find is that this was a group in, I think, the early 70s. It was created with support of Ashkenazi social workers to do empowerment work with Mizrahi Jews, the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, who were and are incredibly oppressed in Israel. And then I'll just tell you a little story about being in college in Israel, doing my junior year at Hebrew University and going out to the bars with friends from the dorms, Arab friends, Jewish Israeli friends, and a bunch of us Jewish, international students. And the cops come and separate out all the Arab kids who are lined up against a wall over here like this, searched, asked for their papers, and etc. And I'm standing there watching like, this is familiar. This is familiar. So going back to my comment about, I think part of our challenge is the limits of our language and terminologies that we're using. I just think it's too simplistic to be like, is Zionism racism? Is this racist? It's too simplistic and you lose the nuance, and it's so much more complicated. And we need to have a sense of urgency. Babies are dying. Babies are dying because of what governments are doing. And now that I'm a parent, I feel really differently about that than I did as a kid growing up going to Jewish school and being socialized into exactly what we heard from the speaker yesterday. That was the party line. Yeah. They want to push us into the sea, yeah. And you can't really ever trust them because they want to kill us. But I think that overlaying these different frames can have its utility, but it's also dangerous, and I think that we need to push ourselves around the terminologies that we use.
That's so right. Yeah, we need to be able to have complex conversations and develop new language for ways to talk about, to have a complex analyses which are missing. It's so interesting when you just said, so Zionism, I thought, I guess I have my own kind of Zionism, don't I? And I think Israel deserves a homeland, deserves a state, should have a state, is a people. I also think Palestine is a people and should have a state and should be a people. One of the times I went to Israel, we met with these guys in this group called One. I don't know if you know this thing, but they were like Israeli soldiers and Palestinian soldiers who were working together on community organizing. So the Israeli soldier was back with his Israeli friends and the Palestinian soldier was with his Palestinian friends, and they would really be trying to find a way to build dialogue. And in that moment in time, a two-state solution felt like, oh, people were trying to say, yeah, we can do it, we can do it. That doesn't feel like where we are right now. People aren't feeling like we can do it. And I'm not a scholar or an expert on Palestine and Israel and two-state solution, so I'm not. But I do have the sense that all the people need a space. I just do, a space. And I think that's the kind of Zionist I am, I guess I would say. I think everybody should have a space, a homeland and a space. And when you say that out loud in places, and this is what is heartbreaking as a person who's just a Christian black girl, you're like, you gotta be careful where you say what you say, because then it doesn't seem like you're Jewish enough, and then maybe it doesn't seem like you're Arab enough, and I'm neither. I'm just a theologian who thinks everyone needs a space, psychologically, a psychologist who thinks everyone needs a space. And I feel like I'm about to go on a road from your question, so I want to come back quickly to say, the parallels between the ways that people are made homeless or spaceless, Native American people, African American people, Jewish people, Palestinian people. People who are made homeless and spaceless have a certain kind of trauma. Yeah. And the trauma is real and needs to be a part of conversations of healing, and where do we go from here?
Thank you both. I have one last question and I want to open it up for Q&A. So when you talk about the founding of the State of Israel, and you talk about it as a space, homeland, this is its sort of identity in the world historical narrative. I often find myself, and before today really found myself wondering if this maybe gets a little bit at the allegiance of, or the kind of alliance that people might see between whiteness or racism, respectively, and the Zionist state as it exists today. I wonder if had a genocides are regularly attempted in the world. That's an unfortunate fact. The genocide we call the Holocaust happened on European soil by Europeans to other Europeans. You mentioned this was the establishment of the State of Israel was a liberation of European Jews from this historical marginal.
Zionism is a liberation movement. A little bit different.
Thank you for clarifying. Right, because Zionism, of course, predates the Holocaust, for sure. That's right. Yes. But my question is, had a genocide against Jews happened on the scale of the Holocaust in a similarly compressed time frame in the 20th century, but not on European soil, in North Africa, in Iraq or Iran, where there were Jewish populations, would the same response have occurred regarding the need to establish a state for those refugees, for those displaced people, for those homeless people, given that that is not often the response to genocides that happen elsewhere around the world?
I feel like we can pontificate about that, but that's not what happened. And that's not where the Zionist movement was. The Zionist movement was very old already by 1948. And the experience of Jews in the Middle East and North Africa was very different. It wasn't the same everywhere. But generally, we can say it was not the same as Jews in Europe, that there were lots of bright spots of coexistence and I mean, look at the holiday of Maimuna. Mm-hmm. North African Jewish holiday of Maimuna, the day after Passover. All the non-Jewish neighbors are bringing over chametz, the forbidden food during Passover. That's the holiday of Maimuna. So I think it's an interesting question. I think that I understand what you're getting at, but I don't think it's a useful question.
Well, it's also an irresponsible question because all counterfactuals are irresponsible and sort of lacking historical texture and context. It's an experiment. Yeah.
I love when I'm in the academic panels and yeah, I don't have an answer for that question, but I would say something like,
Please.
I would say, I think we need to be talking about reparations, about Judaism and about Palestinian folk and about African American folk and about indigenous people. I think we need to be talking about what does it mean to make the world right again, to make the world better again. I don't know what it looks like, but I think return, I think space, I think how can the barbed wire go away, I think how can houses be returned, I think can I give back the land my church is built on to the Lenape from whom we stole the land? I think, can I send all the black kids to college? I mean, I have really weird thoughts about this stuff. And I think that overlapping, those intersections are really important. And they're really important spaces for allyship and for theological discourse and rigorous academic discourse and psychological discourse. Because we are a traumatized people dealing with traumatized people. And I want to repeat that to say hurt people hurt people. Mm-hmm. And they just do. So if we don't really acknowledge the absolute pain that people are in and the suffering that they've encountered and the ways they've been marginalized and the ways they've been set apart and set down, we end up having conversations that just hurt more and more. We end up in a defensive posture, not saying, my bad, tell me more about that. And I think we're in a really critical time, right here in America. Like, this is a hot mess time. And we're on the way to the 2020 election, and the people who are in office, this administration, is intent on us despising each other, deriding each other, breaking down our culture. They're intent upon building hatred upon hatred. And I want to think about that together. That's my core message. That's me pivoting from your question to my core message.
It was elegantly done. Let me open it up for questions from the audience. Okay, hand shot up right there.
So, just one word about myself. I'm Israeli, and I grew up in Israel. I served in the army. I graduated University of Tel Aviv. And I want to say to the woman in the middle whose name I didn't catch,
Shahanna.
Shahanna, thank you. I appreciate every word you said from the bottom of my heart. I also want to say that yesterday's talk was very emotionally traumatic for me because I've been a peace activist for 30 years. And I've been called names by fellow Israelis, even though I was a lieutenant in the Israeli army, by people who were 18 calling me Arafat's whore, by settlers in Hebron throwing diapers on me full of baby shit because I supported the end of the occupation. I think that the students who came here to protest what I felt was a misinterpretation of everything Hannah Arendt ever said about her objection to eternal anti-Semitism. The speaker, with all due respect to her age and wisdom, was promoting the idea that Jews have always longed to return to the homeland of Palestine, and that is historically not true. There has never been a tradition of pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The term Zionism actually came from Christian evangelicals who prayed to the concept of an idea of holiness rather than a territory. I'll finish in a second, just one thing. And I just want to say that if you object to today's politics in America, that does not make you anti-Christian or anti-white. But if you object to the politics of Zionism, you become a Jew hater. And I am a Jew, so I can't be a Jew hater. I object to the politics of discrimination and occupation. And I think that it's very important that people know that there's a difference between Judaism and Zionism. I'm sorry if it's not a question.
Okay. Student questions over here in the front.
Hi.
Hi.
So before you mentioned this distinction between personal and historical when engaging in conversations. So how do you suggest, like, just to expand more on how this is handled in discussions and how it can be used to make discussions more nuanced?
Thank you, Hannah. If I said distinguish, cool. I mean, we are always both personal and political. Right? I'm a feminist, I'm a womanist. I'm always personal and I'm always political. I'm always particular and I'm always universal. So if we are conscious of that and honest about that, I think that's what makes our conversations nuanced. So we don't thingify each other, we don't objectify each other, we don't act as though my particular experience speaks for all the African American women in a black leather jacket. Right? I am particular, and I am also bringing a body of people with me. So we need to be in both places while we're having these conversations so we can honor each other and honor each other's stories. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's how we do it. We listen.
Shahanna, did you want to comment?
Like how it well, you kind of clarified, but what I said was that how, like, I guess keeping in mind your personal and the historical fact, how that can make a conversation nuanced.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's important to really understand history. We have all these really simplistic, fake stories about what came before. And I think it's really critical that we reach for facts and historical analysis in this work around intergroup relations, in this work around co-liberation. Because I think that a lot of the missteps and where things get messy and weird is because actually people don't have good information about the context that they're in. And I think that's some of what we saw yesterday with the student protest and the speaker.
Do we have any other student questions? Yes, over here, and then we'll go to the alongside her in the row. Thank you.
America is founded on well, now we use the term of make America great again. But like, as a student and knowing history classes, when was there ever like a time period when America is great? And my question to you is like, how do we start to spread more the valid information about Jews, about Africans, about whites? Because we can't just spread wrong information. That's where stereotypes start. I want to know what could we do as students to like make a change and whatnot. Yeah.
I love that question. So has America ever been great? There's not been any good old days. Let me put it that way from my point of view. There's no good old days. That's how I would say it. But I would say I have hope when I look at this incredible diversity of students right here. And what Shahanna just said is this idea of really deeply knowing and understanding history. So you're disrupting history when you're asking the question, when was America great? You want to know the story. You want to know the story of this nation deeply. And you want to know the story of Islamic people in America, and Chinese people in America, and Jewish people in America, right? And Latinx people in America, and black people in America. And that there's more than one Latinx story, right? There's more than one black story. So that's about digging deep. Maybe that's about asking your professors, your teachers, to make sure that they have wider-based curriculum than you usually have. I know Bart does all that in a pack of chips, but like, how many stories can we put in our mind? How many different kinds of writers can we have conversation with so that our wisdom is stretched? And then we'll know how to make America great for the first time.
Thanks. Okay.
Can I say something
Yes.
about that? A very quick idea. Including Jews in the narrative about what we mean when we say we're a diverse community. Including Jews in the narrative about multiculturalism. If you have equity work happening at your schools, including Jews. Because one of the things that's funky about anti-Semitism is it's real confusing, and there are wide world opportunities to get involved in fighting racism. There aren't wide world opportunities to get connected to fighting anti-Semitism. That is a good, important challenge to our progressive project and ideals around coalition building, is how do we include anti-Semitism in the work that we're doing against oppression, and how do we include Jews in the narrative about what we mean when we say diversity.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Can I dovetail on that?
Yeah.
I had one of my closest Jewish friends tells me that in America, the Jews are so conflated. Sean, I would love if you would speak to that, but like this idea that there is one kind of Jew. Mm-hmm. So Jews can't be oppressed because they have wealth, or they have like this narrative that is like a trope, actually not a real story, but a trope of what Judaism is, and how difficult it is for us to think about bringing Jewish stories to the table of oppression, because we've stereotyped Jews as not being oppressed. Yeah. What is there to add to that? Yeah, thank you for that.
I think we've got 2 more questions, so 1 and 2 in the back. Yeah. Go ahead. You first, yeah.
Thank you. This has been really interesting. I guess I come from Soviet Jews who were refugees and got to this country and discovered they were white here and forgot what it was to empathize with a lot of people who are still being oppressed. And so I wanted to ask about this notion of supremacy, because I think when you're talking about Israel, what's so interesting is that you have what used to be a minority population that has now become a majority and does what majorities often do, which is oppress minorities. And yet, you still have Jewish minorities throughout the world. And so, how do you separate out anti-Semitism from supremacy? And Jewish supremacy institutionally even in Israel, and white supremacy here. So yeah, I guess that's my question.
Thanks.
When you said that, it made me go back to a biblical story. I'm a theologian and a psychologist, but it made me go back to the biblical story of Joseph and his brothers and how they hated Joseph and they threw him into slavery, and then, like a horrible thing happens. He's the runt and they hate him because he's beautiful, and he ends up sold into slavery, and instead of dying, he ends up in Egypt, and he's like the king's cupbearer. Woohoo, right? And then he becomes wealthy. And his brothers come and live with him in this wealthy, beautiful thing. But then the Jews get powerful. Then Joseph gets powerful. And then they become enslaved. And that's just this horrible cycle of when you get powerful, somebody wants to chop your head off. When you get powerful, someone wants to take away your power. And But
haven't you become powerful at the expense of somebody else?
Okay, in that biblical story, no. But yes, that's true, right? In that story, Joseph just grows. They just grow. They just become populous. Yeah. So I would say, is power a zero-sum concept?
Great question.
In my theological and psychological space, no, it is not. It is not a zero sum. What has happened in the United States of America and in every place in the Western world where people think that is pogroms and annihilation, right?
Yeah.
Power is better and plentiful when we share. There is enough power, love, and wealth and health for it to go around. But in the Western construct, we have made it a competition zero-sum game, and that's when death happens.
I want to go back to the idea of overlaying one analysis from one society onto another. I mean, I'm very uncomfortable with the framing of Jewish supremacy and white supremacy in the same sentence, but violent repression of Palestinians is happening. It is happening. And one of the problems is that Jews are terrified, okay? I mean, and it didn't just happen today, and it's not just Trump. It's like 1,000 years of European history and cultural norms. So I felt a little scared when you said that. But I think zooming out and having an analysis of oppression, liberation, power over time in different societies can be useful in looking at the dynamic that you described. But I think that it's very difficult for Jews to, when white supremacy gets, that we need to come up with some great strategies and some great analysis that we're using consistently as progressives about what it is and what it isn't. Because the triggers make a lot of us go, and then that's it. And we saw that with the students here. I mean, a lot of that is our terror and our generational trauma as Jews. It's not, oh, I want to kill a Palestinian. It's the terror that I've learned over, 10 generations. And we need to come to terms with that, and that hurt people. And just because a white ethnic group gets access to whiteness, it doesn't mean that necessarily all the trauma has gone away.
Amen.
Okay. Okay, we have one more question over there, and then we got to wrap up. Sorry.
So first of all, with regard to Jewish whiteness, I was born in 1948. I grew up in Logan in Philadelphia. I went to an elementary school, 1/3 black, 1/3 what I called white, that was white Christian, and 1/3 Jewish. When I speak with a couple of black friends now who say, but Mark, you're white, I say, well, if I'm white, I'm recently white. So that's number one. Number two.
I'm going to have to ask you to get to your question because we have to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, just to get comments on this, if I may.
It really needed to be a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what about the proposition that Zionism, as was suggested, but to enlarge on that, Zionism, political Zionism, is an outgrowth of late 19th century European imperialism and colonialism, which I think we now recognize is at its core racist. Can you comment on that, please?
I think when we look at Hannah Arendt, we see that tension. I'm not an Arendtian scholar, but I know a little bit about her work, and I know there was all this revolutionary stuff, and then there was also this weird stuff about the savages, and, right? Am I on track here? Yes, the Arendtian scholars are nodding their heads. So I think, though, that it is important to remember that this wasn't just another European project to go and civilize savages. It was connected to a movement, the Zionist movement, that it was a movement for liberation against violent hatred against Jews. I think that's an important distinction, because I think that this idea that this is just another European colonial settler project is problematic because it takes anti-Semitism out of the equation. But did it bleed in there, and is it a part of the story? Of course. Of course it's there, but it's not the whole story. That's my opinion.
Yep, what she said. Yeah.
On that happy note of unity, thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, thank you for this panel. We're going right into our next panel. We're going to take like 2 minutes to set up if you need to use the restroom. Let me just say one thing while we're waiting for our next panel to come up, and I invite them to come up and sit down. I said in my opening remarks yesterday that if we're going to create the kind of society we want, we're going to have to not just have dialogue, but open ourselves to listen and to be uncomfortable and to be pushed. And I think a lot of us, most of us, I hope, all of us in this room are experiencing that today. Discomforts on many sides, being provoked, being made to feel uncomfortable. And I do hope that is part of what this conference is about. Hearing things that make you think, make you angry, and then trying to process them, as some of our speakers have said. So I hope that's what's happening. I hope you're all engaged in that activity. And I think our next panel will continue to make you uncomfortable. You know, I teach a class, and when I begin the class, I say to my students, my whole goal is to make you much less happy by the time this class is over than when you came into it. And I believe that's in large part what my job as an educator is, to make you tear down your self-certainties and open yourself up to a new way of seeing the world in a much more nuanced and complicated way, as many of our speakers have been suggesting today. So please, can I have the next panel come up and sit down? I'm sorry, I just wanted to underscore how important it is what we're doing here today, and encourage you to continue doing what we're doing here today.
So we'll start with Mark.
And then we'll end around 1:35, 1:40
Yeah.
at the latest.
And so
and I'll come up and
you
just
want
say
me to introduce them?
Yeah,
and
but very
then-
briefly.
Very briefly, and then ask them a question after they've made their presentations. And
Or
then
you can go just straight to it. It's a short panel. It's up to you. I'll let you. If you feel like you have something, or otherwise, just go straight to questions.
We're up in Australia. So she gets a $25,000 first class Qantas flight from Los Angeles to Australia. She insists on it for her. Yeah, she has to have first class A class. She was getting $20,000. She was getting such a $50,000 for 2 bucks. And she just wouldn't even. When she was with Christina Hawk Summers, when she didn't know that, and when audience members started objecting, she said that she didn't want to. And she almost actually just reneged on her whole speaking contract, you know? Because she wasn't there to actually engage somebody who disagreed with her. It's like the new model, if you have a big enough platform, you just pronounce, you know?
Well, in a way, isn't that kind of consistent with social media?
Yes, exactly. It's
Right.
one way.
Yeah.
It's really one way. It's social media's changing public speaking.
I give you credit for engaging in all this, because like sometimes like all I want to do is just bury my head under a pillow and just get away. I mean, some of these encounters, I mean, even though I thought what she said was correct about what Alice